Okay, today we're going to talk about the family farm exemption provisions under the Duties Act.
Yes.
Quite a complex area, full of definitions. Definition of transferee, definition of transferor, definition of family farm exemption.
Yeah.
What have I missed? Definition of primary production.
Yeah.
And the
Farming
definition
property.
of farming property.
Yeah.
And it's an area that we've touched on quite a bit through succession processes.
Yes.
And unfortunately, it's an area where other people that interact with farmers that aren't lawyers often get wrong. So Matilda, some of the key points we'll talk about today.
So we're going to look at actually who this exemption is applicable to. So looking at the definition, like you said, of transferor and transferees. We're going to look at what it actually means, so why you'd be looking at getting this exemption. And we're also going to be looking at the evidence you actually need to supply in order to be granted the exemption, because that's a key point and a key issue that we come across when we're seeking this exemption, is actually having the proof to back it up.
Yeah. So what's the exemption itself? What is it?
So like I said, it's under the Duties Act, and it's applicable to dutiable transactions between family members. So that's property and major assets.
Yep.
Typically we see it in property settlements.
Yep.
So like you said, succession, so transferring land to other family members, so a son returning to the farm or a daughter. Seeking the exemption, because duty can be quite significant on farming property,
Yep.
given that the value has increased significantly. So an exemption will essentially mean you don't have to pay any duty on that transaction, which is
Yeah.
a massive benefit to a farming operation.
Yeah. And so the public policy reason behind it is to assist financially, so that there's no duty imposed on generational change in the farming business.
Yeah, and exactly, to recognise that, a son returning to the farm might not have the same assets as his father.
Or daughter.
Or daughter, like I said.
Yeah.
So it's to accommodate that, and it's also to recognise that these sorts of transactions don't happen that frequently. So, it's kind of you're granted it because you're not likely to transfer it again, the next year or the year after that. It's kind of a long term.
Yeah. And so I mentioned definitions earlier.
Yes.
Let's start with a few of those.
So
transferor.
yes, so we'll get to the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
So the transferor has to be an individual, other than a trustee, whom the
Individual.
Yeah, so that's the first hurdle, an individual. So
a natural person.
exactly, natural person. So not a company, not a partnership,
Yeah.
not a trust. It's got to be a person.
Yeah. And this is an area, I think, where a lot of advisors fall into the trap, because they consider that whoever owns the land has an immediate right to transfer it to whoever they like, and duty will be exempt simply because it's farmland.
Exactly.
Not
And
the case.
No, exactly. And as we know that farming structures in particular, vary these days. You have trusts, you'll have a corporate trustee acting as the trustee, and that's who the property might be registered to, the company. And so essentially determining whether you're in a position as an individual to transfer that land is the first step in whether or not you can be eligible for this exemption.
Yeah. And so we've talked about transferor.
Yes.
Transferee.
Yes.
Slightly wider definition.
It is. So this is the person that you're transferring the land to. And so that essentially means a person, so a family member of the transferor. It can be a trustee of a trust, and it can be a trustee of a discretionary trust as well. So that encapsulates a corporate trustee as well.
Yeah.
But there are some key points that you have to remember here, and that is that under that, if they are acting as a trustee of a trust, each beneficiary of that transferor has to be a family member. The transferor is not the only beneficiary of that trust, and the transferor does not have control of that trust.
Yeah.
So again, not a simple definition.
No, that's right. And prior to, I think, 2019, if the transferor was conducting part of the business, or was part of the business conducting operations on the land,
Yes.
and they were also a transferee as a beneficiary, say, a duty applied.
Yes, yeah.
But that law has changed now, so that the easy example is that there's a partnership, farming the land. One of the partners owns the land.
Mm-hmm.
The land is then transferred, but the partnership continues to farm the land.
Yes.
In those circumstances, there still will be duty. The exemption will apply.
Yes. Yeah.
Subject to a few other bits and bobs. All right. So we've talked about family member. What's a family member?
So
Key
again,
concept.
Duties Act has its own definition, so it's not who you think is your family member. Yes, it could be a child, it could be a parent or a brother or a sister, but you have to actually look at the lineage. So in this instance, they have included an uncle or an aunt of that person. They've also included a brother or a sister-in-law.
Yep.
A spouse, former spouse, de facto. It doesn't go broader than that. They've tried to accommodate as much as they can, but before you can say, oh, that's a family member, that's who I'm going to transfer it to, you actually need to refer back to the Duties Act to confirm whether they are a family member.
Yeah, and it becomes important in the context of the definition of transferee, particularly where you're transferring land into a trust.
Yes, exactly.
And if a beneficiary of the trust is a charity or is a corporate, and there are a lot of trust deeds out there that have been prepared through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and even the 2010s, which have been prepared on the basis that they are, the family trust, but include charities and corporates as beneficiaries. And so the transfers into that environment will actually attract duty.
Exactly. So you have to look at who's listed as those beneficiaries, specified beneficiaries, general beneficiaries, and essentially it's got to be family members. It's got to be, your spouse, your children, their grandchildren, your uncle and aunt, whoever you want, but it's really got to be confined to those restraints. So like I said before with the documents, it's a case of looking at your trustee and actually knowing who is a family member. And I think you've touched on this, but essentially this is an issue when you're looking at transferring it to a transferee that's going to be operating that, going to be using that land through a different structure as well. So if they're transferring to an individual or trustee of a trust, and then that trust is trustee, of another trust, or a company's involved, that's when you have to ascertain, whether you're actually eligible for the exemption.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the key concepts here too is that the land's got to be used for primary production.
Yes.
Now that's a case for the transferor, and the transferee needs to have an intention to continue to use it for primary production.
Yes.
So what's primary production mean?
Again, long list of definitions. So it has captured essentially what primary production is. So it's growing crops, it's vegetables, it's rearing animals for production. It is quite broad and it's very good. But I suppose the pitfall is it doesn't define use to an extent. So it determines what primary production is, but it doesn't go further to describe what use actually refers to. So you could be using the land in a share farming agreement, for instance, or leasing the land, all for primary production, but it's a question of what portion of that land is being used for primary production. It needs to be the dominant purpose of that.
Well, we think it needs to be the dominant purpose, absolutely right, But if you are leasing your land, even if you're leasing your land to your neighbour, say, who is engaging in primary production on the land, are you engaged in primary production if you're leasing it?
You need to show that you're getting an income from primary production. So the land has to be used for primary production, but you have to be able to show on your tax return, whatever financial statements you have, that you're actually deriving an income from primary production. And I think that's something that we've seen in a lot of cases where you lease it out or you've got some agreement in place where that income is not actually being shown on your tax return, and that's where there's issues, because you need to be able to show that it actually is being used for that purpose, regardless if you're physically on the property or not. You need to show that you're deriving an income from that.
That you are as the transferor.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like you said, with a transferee, it's showing an intent to continue using the land for primary production.
Okay. What else have we got on this topic?
So we talked about the documents key. I've mentioned obviously financial statements. It's also your trust deeds and variations. It's also agreements that you have with your leasee, your neighbour, your son or your daughter, who's using the land. Another important point is, like I said, you can use, if you're a transferee and you're an individual, you can definitely farm the land in a different entity structure. That's allowed under the Act. It's just meeting those initial definitions. So are you an individual that's transferring land to an individual or a trustee of a trust where it's only family members? You were then allowed to farm the property we're not allowed, you're able to farm the property in a different entity's name. That will not disqualify you from getting this exemption. But really it is that documentation, being able to show that it's been used for primary production, that you're the transferor, you're an individual, but it's also that you've been immediately using that land prior to it being transferred. So if you'd used the land 10 years ago for primary production, it hadn't been used for primary production since, then it's the discretion
of the commissioner
to determine whether or not you qualify for this exemption. So that's a little, I suppose, little tweak that we've picked up as well.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other issues too is that another reason why you need to properly consider this process is that if you as an individual are a transferor or as defined, and you're transferring the land into a trust environment,
yes,
so it becomes duty exempt, the trust then can't transfer that land under the current laws to anyone else without a duty impost.
Exactly.
And so it might make sense at the moment to transfer the land into a trust environment, but that's not then considering the next transfer down the generational line. So
yes,
a few things to think about with this type of exercise.
Absolutely.
And with the high value of farmland, the duty impost can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a big cost to bear to get it wrong.
Exactly. So, we encourage you, if you think you're eligible for the exemption, we will look at what you provide us with, go through the details to see whether you do qualify, because like you said, it is definitely a benefit being able to access that exemption.
Yeah. Okay, so where can people come to get further advice on this?
So you can contact Phil or I. Our contact details are on our website. They're also on our social media pages, so Facebook. And this video will be posted on Facebook and YouTube as well. So if you have any questions, please leave a comment, send us an email, or contact us at the office.
Great. Thanks, Matilda.
Thank you.